Hello everyone, welcome to our Teaching English webinar for teacher educators, in which Lucy, Maina and Hicks will discuss the role of language in ensuring inclusion in a complex language settings. My name is Shirin and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all so much for joining this live event. Before we start this session, I'd like to share a number of quick housekeeping reminders with you. While waiting, please share with us in the Q&A where you are from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in in-service, type in-service in the Q&A. So this session is being recorded and a recording of the webinar will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days. The link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive this week. And finally, you will have a chance to ask questions during our session. Please use the Q&A to ask our presenters your questions. We'll be using the chat for announcements only. So let me introduce you to our presenters today. Lucy, Maina, and Hicks will be presenting. So Hicks is an education consultant who has worked for British Council and Education Development Trust, among other organizations. He has worked in a range of countries in Africa as a teacher, trainer, curriculum developer, and researcher. And more recently, he has been involved in working on language in conflict and refugee settings. And Lucy Maina is a professional with over 20 years of experience in program development, education, and public health management. Lucy has worked in various countries as a trainer, researcher, in policy formulation, management, and fundraising. She has worked on language in conflict, language policy in refugee and development settings. So Rod and Lucy, and yes, Rod will join us. Hi, Lucy. We can't hear you. Yes.
Hello,
no,
everyone.
Hello, hi, Rod. Okay, so over to you to start today's session.
Thank you very much. Can I have the slides? Yes. Good morning, everybody. If you're in England, good afternoon, or from wherever you are. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss the work Lucy and I have been doing within the refugee context. The title of our webinar is Language and Inclusion. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. Okay, now we can move. Language and inclusion when teaching in a refugee setting is our title. Can we have the next slide? Right. During this presentation, which will be shared between Lucy and myself, first we will outline the purpose of this webinar. We'll then present the context of refugee education in Uganda, where Lucy and I have been carrying out research for the British Council. And we will therefore outline some of those research findings around language and exclusion in the refugee-impacted schools. After that, we will look at some of the recommendations that attempt to address the key problems when teaching in classes. And our recommendations will very much be classroom-based. We'll outline the implementation of these recommendations. And then we'll look at the impact of these recommendations on schools and discuss which recommendations worked well and what didn't. And with you, I hope you will be able to join in giving further action or advice to the work we've done. Next slide. So the purpose is to look at how languages impact on refugees learning in Uganda government schools. In fact, the impact is on the whole school of refugees, not just on the refugees. We will consider when it is beneficial and possible to use the first or familiar language of the refugee learners. We use the shortage FL to mean familiar language, not always there first. We'll then explore how a sensitive approach to language use in education can make the classroom more inclusive for those arriving from different language communities. And finally, we will highlight the use of two languages when teaching and how it can have benefits to the learner, as research has shown in many settings, but also how, if used inappropriately, it can also be damaging to learning English of those in the classroom. Next slide. Thank you. Normally in the refugee setting, you'd expect trauma to be, and solutions to trauma being a major part of any presentation. However, I excuse us because we are not experts, and we really believe that trauma is such a major topic, it needs a separate webinar and bringing in people with more expertise than us. So excuse us for avoiding that topic. Now, before I hand over to Lucy, I'd like you to consider three questions, in fact, but two of them, you have a poll or quiz. Will the teachers you train be exposed to multilingual and multi-level settings when teaching English or teaching in English? Choose, is this for your teachers, your training, is this very common? Is it rare? Or is it something which is occasional? Has everybody made a vote? Oh, now very encouraging, at least 51, but half of you, it is a very common setting. So we know that it is hopefully what we say is relevant, and you may also be able to strongly disagree from your experiences or agree with what we say, which is great. That's very encouraging for us because it means we know the rest of the presentation is relevant. All right, thank you. You can close that. The second question, do you as a trainer offer advice on how to handle multilingual classes? Yes, no, or for that 15%, it's not applicable. Please give us your votes now. Excellent. Thank you. So yes, a majority, everybody is saying they do give advice. I'm glad about that. We will be able to discuss what that advice is once we know. With 78 of you giving advice, 8% no, 14% is similar to, as with the previous poll, it's not applicable. Thank you very much. Poll closed. The third question is not a poll, and it is something to come for the 78% who said yes, they do give advice. Now, or as we go through, could you put in the Q&A any single key piece of advice that you give your learners, your teachers in training? Tell them what you advise them to do, and we can come back to this at the end and compare your advice with what advice comes out of the research. Thank you. Okay, now I will step aside and let Lucy take you through our main findings from the research and the recommendations that were made. Thank you, Lucy. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rod, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to present the research part of this wonderful program. So I'll start off with just explaining about the language of resilience and then moving on to the findings of the research. So as the title suggests, language for resilience is key to inclusion, self-sufficiency, and reestablishing a family's respect and independence after the traumas of being forced into a refugee setting. That's if you're going to a new country, or as an IDP if you are in the same country. Language for Resilience is a British Council program and very active in its support of refugee communities, especially in Uganda and Ukraine. These activities, the activities under Language for Resilience have included research into both language and education, training teachers and supporting teachers in refugee-impacted schools, addressing the effects of trauma and impact of conflict, and our work in Uganda and whatever we'll present today was a key part of the Language for Resilience program. So we really like this quote, about language is a problem that is both immediately evident in the classrooms, and teachers can attest to this, and fundamental to learning success. So this was said by Trudel in 2019. So in terms of the background to the research work, we look at two issues. One is the policy issue, and Uganda has an amazing policy on refugees. So all refugees are welcome and encouraged to integrate. They are subsidized with support from UNHCR and provided they stay in a settlement. They may only stay outside the settlements if they are self-supporting. The children are integrated into the local schools, and families are provided with small plots of land within the settlement so they can grow their food. So basically they live like residents of Uganda as they're there. It's really different from my country. We are not that generous. Secondly, it's the typical settlement of schools. So if you think about the settlements, they are large rural settlements, and they take several hours to drive across. So if you think about like from Bidibidi to Isinjiro, Navkivale, and all those places, usually takes several hours to drive across. They have children from many countries. So they teach children from Somalia, Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and some recent increases from South Sudan and DRC that cause a strain to the system. And the other thing was that we had a wide range of languages in a settlement. So like we had a settlement that had 19 different home languages in a settlement. So just one settlement has a lot of languages. And so some of the strains we can see, like this, this was a photo we took that when we were in the settlement, and you can see like the classes are really crowded. So we had classes up to 300 learners. And I think the least we saw was like 100 learners. One of the classes we went to, we couldn't even move. Like where you stand, that's where you be for the rest of the lesson, because the teacher can't even move because of the numbers. Then the other issue is the lack of facilities with many temporary classrooms. You can see this is a school that has temporary classes. And I think this is a Window International School. You can see their logo at the bottom left. And then now I want to look at who was involved in the research. So we had about 50 different schools across 8 settlements. And also we had 8 schools impacted by refugees in Kampala. So we did both the settlements up north, but also Kampala. We had about 2,000 teachers participating. We had about 50,000 learners, 50 families and parents, and we also talked with the different education leaders, the DIS, we also talked to UNHCR, and we also had a lot of support from Window International, who we really thank for making this successful also. In the initial research, 2018-2020, we collected different types of data. One was on the languages being used by the teachers, the learners, and the class assistants by using classroom observation. So we went to these classes and we were able to tell the languages that were being used by these different people. We also had, we're looking at the teacher attitudes and beliefs about how they use first language or familiar language and English through discussions and questionnaires. We also went ahead to look at the levels of English and literacy of learners and the teachers. And the teachers was, we had to be a bit sneaky. So we asked them to do some essays, and based on the essays, we were able to tell like their levels of English and even some of their attitudes and beliefs. So the languages, we also looked at languages being used at home and by parents. So at home by parents, in community activities, and also for children with their peers, so peer-to-peer. And then finally, we looked at how teachers included or excluded refugee children. So based on this data, we had some key findings. So the key findings on language and inclusions was that most refugees had come from countries that didn't either use English as a language of instruction. For example, the children from DRC, most of them knew French because they came from a French background. The Sudanese learners would speak Arabic. and the Somalia children would speak Somali. So these children would either have very little English or would only speak their first language. So that's the way learning in a new language. Then many learners in the classroom, they were in the classroom physically, and I think many people can attest to this. But if you're not able to communicate with the teachers and other learners outside the people who speak your language, then you're basically excluded from the learning, which is really sad. Then in a class of over 100, so these are large classroom sizes, exclusion of any child with low levels of the language of instruction is almost inevitable. And so especially the children who are in lower classes, that happens a lot. Then other findings are when we went to the Kampala schools, this had led to some cases of aggression and alienation between groups and with teachers. Outside the classroom, the learners stayed with their own language groups, which is very common. You only speak to people you can be able to communicate with and didn't have the skills to mix with the other learners. Then a few families in settlements were not willing to name their language groups due to tensions from conflicts from where they had fled. And then, so that's the inclusion of these learners can only come with increased communication skills, both in a lingua franca, such as Kiswahili, and in English. So some of the worries we had were the very large numbers of languages across a settlement, up to 19 languages in one settlement. So you can imagine what that actually means when it comes to learning. The second bit about the large classes, apart from the large numbers of the languages, was if you have about 300 children speaking different languages, and the average size is like less than 100 or just about 100 children and of mixed groups, then you can imagine what that looks like. Then again, there are these new arrivals who are being placed in the primary grades, which was based on their English language ability. So we are looking at how do they place children when they come from like DRC or they come from South Sudan. And we met these children, which was really sad for us, like a child who had come from DRC, they were in secondary school when they were in DRC, but then when they came to Uganda, they had an English placement test, and because of the low level, they ended up in grade 2 or grade 3. So you can imagine just how they felt as like coming from secondary school to grade 2 or grade 3. Then we had the refugee students who were on average 4 years older than the expected age for the class in which they studied. So they were older children. The teachers were very uncertain as to which languages to use in ECD and lower primary. Remember, we had like one refugee community had like 19 languages. So which one would you use? So policy states that use of language, local language, the language policy states we use local language or familiar language until grade 4. But refugee children don't know the local language or English. So that becomes very worrying. Then a large number of refugee children did not understand the language in which they were being taught, and the teachers did not know the refugee language. So you can imagine, I talk my local language, Rod speaks English, and then there is no way we can communicate. I'm using you, Rod, as my example. And then a majority of lessons were monolingual English lessons with little or no use of any other languages familiar to the students or the learners. And then some teachers and some leaders believed you should not use any other language other than English in school. So when we asked them like what are their beliefs, that's what they told us, that they want to use English and nothing else. But we also had some key findings that offered a way forward. And one of them is that 90% of the families spoke at least 2 languages at home, although not only a few spoke English. Children often played together in a language different from the one they used with their parents and any other adults. So it meant that they also had exposure to another language. Each settlement or at least locations tended to have a common lingua franca, such as Kiswahili or Juba Arabic, depending on which settlement you are looking at. There were also languages that the languages in which children played. And then although there was a complexity of languages across a settlement, most schools were dominated by one or two local languages. So selecting a common local language for instruction is less complex than it might seem, though a school's language composition could change in quite a short time, depending on if there was an influx of refugees from a new conflict zone that did not speak the language that was being used in that school. More good news was that there were many examples of good practice already being adopted by teachers and schools. For example, many teachers and head teachers were trying to learn at least one of the refugee languages which they could relate to. So we had these teachers, I remember when this school with Rod, and these teachers were telling us, oh, now I know a few words from the refugee community. So the teachers were also learning the language from their learners and then using it to communicate. Then some teachers were using their own, they were using several languages in class, including the refugees' own languages, and this was an increasing trend. Then some schools were using written tests and placing newcomers based on the key subject knowledge, not just in English. So there would be other tests that they could use except just the use of English. And then the schools were very open or used accelerated promotion so that a learner could be promoted to the next class. So as soon as you were able to learn the language or you had language skills had improved for you and it was at a level where you could now learn in that language, then you could move on to the next level. And then a few schools where there were school English clubs. So that was encouraging because now the school clubs were able to support the children's English. Some of them involved additional payments, and that was more common in Kampala. But I suppose because maybe the economic status of those in Kampala was better, then they could make those additional payments and the children would benefit from it. Then there were also very excellent examples of peer-to-peer support with new students and those who spoke poor English being helped in class by those who spoke both languages. So there was peer-to-peer support. The teachers also used group work, arranging children by their first language so that those who are bilingual could also get help from the others. And then many learners were also helping to translate for those who are yet to learn English with or without their teacher's approval. So if the kid sat next to another kid that was not understanding, they would like ask each other, like, what did the teacher say? And they'd say, oh, this is what it meant. And so it didn't really disrupt the class, but it helped the children understand better. Yeah, so those were our findings. So before we go to the recommendations, I just wanted to know if there are any questions. Maybe Rod, we could check from the question and answer. Don't worry, Rod will answer all your questions. I do the presentation, he answers all the questions, so that's fine. So if you have any questions.
That's not what we agreed, Lucy. I answer the easy ones, you answer the difficult ones.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing these useful insights from your research. And Rod, when you asked our audience to write their advice, what advice they give, we received lots of comments. So I'd like to start with these very briefly. So mainly the advice, first of all, our participants give is about empathy and cultural consideration. For example, Corina says, don't push them over the limit. Fiona says to respect and have empathy on diverse cultural environments. I couldn't read one of our participants' names, but I asked ChatGPT to help me with this. I think it is Crisanti. So to respect and consider the different cultures as well as using differential education. And we also received some advice about the language use, like Corina says, use the second language and TPR. Clarence says, use the familiar language until they're able to pick. And I suggest that they use other ways besides translation to show meaning. And Abdul says, try to use English always. However, use any other language if situation demands. And Mediha says, use bilingual method until the audience is able to understand English to some extent. We also received some comments about student engagement and inclusion, such as Be active and positive in class at all times. The Buddha says, be inclusive in your teaching. And finally, Nadesta says, my small piece of advice, get to know your refugee students at the very beginning, family background, level of English. So these are some of the comments we received earlier. And I'd like to move on with the question. So Kishwar asked a question. Can you please explain the word resilience in English again? So I think this would be really nice to get started.
Yes, that's Lucy, do you want to take that or shall I?
Oh, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
It's obviously that's almost one should go across to the British Council long term to decide. But the idea of language in basically, if you're going to survive through difficulties, then the first stage of that survival as a refugee is the fact that you can communicate with people around you. The language doesn't have to be English. So if you are a new refugee in Rhino refugee camp, you really need to be able to talk to people in Juba Arabic and then later in English in order to get your food, in order to become accepted by the society. And then you need the English in order to start learning so that you become a useful member of that society. So it's the idea of your language provides you with self-sufficiency, which means you're more resilient. And you need to be resilient. If you've been a refugee, some of the refugees coming through from particularly DRC have been through some horrific experiences. So this is the language is the beginning of rebuilding their life. That's a long answer to a short question, but thank you. It's a very good question.
Another question, Lucy, you already mentioned this about teaching language in crowded, large classrooms. And Kishwar asked this question, what is the proper way of teaching language in overcrowded classrooms? Could you give us some more specific ways or considerations in teaching large classes?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned some of them, and one of them, which we saw that was already being done by the teachers, was use of group work. When you put the children in groups, then that helps them because then they're able to support each other. Of course, the first thing is use a language that they understand, preferably a familiar language, and then using the familiar language in the classroom, but then also now being able to break that down by using the groups, because when you put children in groups, they're able to speak to each other, they're able to ask each other. Like you can imagine if you're in a class of 200 children, if you're shy and you can't ask questions, then you're not going to raise your hand and be answered to. So the easier way is to group the children, think about their English capacities, think about how they can support each other, put them in groups, and that has helped. And that's not just language, but any time you are teaching large classrooms, group work is always a very good idea, where you could you bring the children together and be able to work with the different children. Then the other bit is of course, when we talk about multilingual, and then Rod will be talking about this in a short while. Multilingual is also very important because then children, most of the children already know something, or they have some knowledge, background knowledge in a different language. So what is the barrier here is the language that you are now using. So being able to use multilingual, where you can break down concepts into language, a language they can understand, in a language they understand, that helps in terms of breaking it down for the children. And then now you can use that, now start giving them oral language, which is very, very important. And I'm sure Rod agrees with me. If you start with oral language, then it's always easier for the children to pick it up and then move on to the next level. Rod, do you want to add in to that?
Yeah, well, I'll probably be coming back to that, but the idea of group work is not just group work by ability, but group work by language in the initial stages. So, you know, in a small group, they may all be Swahili speakers, but there will be, some of them won't understand English, but others will be able to translate and bridge the language. So language groups in the early stages. Of course, once you want them to go forward in English, then you can mix them so that they can't use the first language, but that comes at a later stage. Yeah. I think the other thing is to make sure there's lots of activities for the children to do, so they're not sitting listening to the teacher all the time, but there's individual work where they're doing things individually. You then have the problem that the teacher has 100 books to look at, but at least you can do activities in which they do drawings or write things, and then there you get peer marking, so they look at each other's work to avoid the problem of marking 100 books every day. Over, yeah.
Thank you so much, Rod. So if you like, we can continue the presentation considering the time. And our colleagues, please keep writing your questions in the Q&A. We received a question about trauma, about how you approach it. So what is your opinion about talking about past trauma? But you intentionally didn't include the trauma in your presentation. So that's you mentioned this, Rod, at the beginning. Would you like to mention this again so that, yes, our colleagues.
By all means. I mean, I'm very strongly of the opinion trauma is such a vital area that people need, the teachers need clear training of how to manage kids who are traumatized, added to which you have the problems in many conflict areas where the teachers themselves are traumatized. I taught in Somalia at a very crucial area, and I was more concerned about the trauma of the teachers than I was of the students, because the students were so frightened of their teachers. But it's not something I would like to see to claim to have any expertise in. Every teacher needs a sort of a toolkit and needs to be able to recognize trauma, but you need specialists coming in to advise teachers and to help. So it's not something I'd like to go, it's not a line I'd like to be seen as giving advice. I've not got enough experience, even though I've been in quite a few with quite a few traumatized children and teachers. Over. That's my non-answer.
Thank you so much. Let's continue, and we will have Q&A later on. And yes, we will have a final Q&A as well. So colleagues, please keep writing in the Q&A. And yes, now Rod will continue with the multilingualism.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy, once again.
Okay, no, I just wanted to alert Rod. You can start from the second question. I think that's because I was going to do the second question to let you know recommendations.
Oh, okay, yes. If you were training teachers for refugee-impacted schools, what guidelines might you offer? This is similar to what you already put into the initial chat. We want to get as many of your guidelines, and some guidelines were already given to us by Shirin, such as the importance of empathy and making sure that teachers could empathize with students. I'll come back to that in a moment, but as we go along, please put in your own suggestions so we can have a result at the end where it's not just Lucy and I telling you what to do or telling you to tell your teachers what to do, but we've come to an agreement among all of us what is good advice to going forward. And of course, every piece of advice changes according to context. So in some contexts, it may be very different from others. Okay, I'm noting some of the advice we'll come back to as well. I think that's what I would have to say on question 2. So please, we will pick up your suggestions later that you put in there. Go ahead, next slide.
Fantastic. So Rod, you can move us to the recommendations.
Right, thank you. Okay, thank you. All right, the recommendations and the action that we took as a result of the findings. The first and the biggest recommendation from everything we did was you need to have a very clear bridging course for new arrivals, so that there's a bridge between both for language and for curriculum content. So that if you're coming from DRC, there will be a bridging course that will help you move from the DRC curriculum to the Ugandan curriculum, or from the South Sudan curriculum to the Uganda curriculum, in order that when you actually start in your class, you need to be put in a grade that is nearer to your age, appropriate to your age, than one which is just appropriate to your English. So we developed with NCDC a bridging course that would cover 6 months full-time learning for those that were most in need. We'd start with a diagnostic test, because if you had good English and good numeracy, there was no need to bridge. You could go in fairly quickly into a school. But 50% of the bridging course could last up to 6 months. Based on your diagnostic tests, you would be placed in one of 3 levels for study. 50% of the course would be at English improvement, with the emphasis on English for learning, so a strong emphasis on listening and understanding. There's also a course for 25% of the time, 20% of the time in literacy for those students who had problems in decoding language. And we started that course by getting them to decode in their familiar language, assuming their familiar language was using the Latin script. Where they came from a different script, such as Arabic, then one obviously would keep the literacy in English. And then there was a third course in numeracy for those that had joined in and had very low levels of numeracy. Both the literacy and numeracy were traditionally using the EGRES type scale. They'd start the literacy or numeracy in their own language. And in the case of numeracy, they would move into English after the first of the 3 courses. A third area we really tried to develop in the bridging course, and I don't think it was very well, it's never really been fulfilled to its potential, that is to make sure you got a curriculum gap filling. So if you're coming from a South Sudan curriculum, something like social studies would be very different content to the Uganda curriculum. Therefore, you need, if you are a 16-year-old and were fit to join grade 8, 7 or 8 or secondary, you needed to be able to both revise and to gap fill information so that you could fit into the classroom more easily, into your class level more easily. So that was the bridging course that we set up and encouraged everybody to go. I say with NCDC, they wrote it with us, but it was UNHCR, of course, and Windle Trust that were to implement it. Next slide. We also wrote 2 handbooks, again, approved by NCDC. We developed them and put them through NCDC for approval. One was for teachers and one handbook was for school managers. Overall, these handbooks provided the recommendations and the guidance coming out of the research. So you were turning what had been a research base into actual actions in the classroom, including how to improve placement of new arrivals and, where possible, use the bridging course, how to use more inclusive practices with refugee children, especially recent arrivals, and how to use both English and the languages of the refugee children, already knowing when already using the language they already know when they are learning English. Those are the 3 broad areas. A little more detail to follow on the next slide. Okay, specific inclusion of new arrivals. We were particularly concerned the way new arrivals were being treated. If you're a new arrival and you're put in a class of 200 children, it's a bit daunting, especially if they're all teaching different languages. So we encourage teachers to greet children in their own language, wherever possible. This meant our poor teachers were expected to at least know greetings in 3 or 4 different languages, which is tough, but actually some of the teachers were amazingly good at this. We had some really encouraging use of teachers. They didn't know the language well, but they were quick to learn to say, hello, how are you? Well done, good, sit there. Secondly, buddy pairs. When you get a new arrival, try and create a buddy with them who speaks the same language. Preferably who speaks the same language, but also knows English. and then they can help the newcomers. And it doesn't have to be just newcomers, even when you've got somebody who's been in the class for some time and has been totally ignored. Set them up with somebody who's got better English but speaks that same first or familiar language. Once the children have developed enough English, then you can switch buddies and give them somebody who can't speak their language, and then they have to communicate in English together, but not until they have that feeling of inclusion. Placement, we put a lot of emphasis in the handbooks, recommending that arrivals need to be placed in grades which are appropriate to their age and knowledge, not just their language, because it was really tragic seeing how many, particularly from DRC, were being placed in grades 2, primary grade 2, when they had been studying in good French. They had excellent French, but no English. And this was so demotivating. And you know that if they went back to grade 2, you were going to lose them in a couple of years if you didn't get. So placement was a crucial area. Both much improved if they'd done the bridging course, but also we liked and recommended accelerated promotion. So if somebody was placed in a low grade because of their language, that must be seen as very temporary. They're placed in the low grade, so the secondary, placed in grade 3, they're given lots of tuition on English, and then within the year, they get promoted to grade 4, grade 5, and we had examples actually, mainly in Kampala, admittedly, where there's good tuition, where children were placed in a grade 3 class, but by the end of the year, they were in grade 6 because they were able to go through. But that was from a very enlightened teacher, and it's breaking down that belief that you only promote at the end of the year was something of an achievement. Next slide. Other recommendations on inclusion: arrange learners in local language groups during lessons, so those better in English can help others. We commented on this during the question and answer session, that you can arrange your groups so that, and this goes on even in secondary, where you know some are weak in English, you make sure they're with people who can explain what's going on. We recommended using buddy pairs, which I've already spoken about, but these were one of the recommendations in the book. And then we recommended teachers using the familiar language for empathy and for instruction, picking up a comment that we had on the advice from somebody earlier about the importance of empathy. We agree very much that teachers learn to empathize. And some of our Ugandan teachers were quite excellent at this. There were some who were very empathetic to the position of the refugee children and making great efforts to learn their language so they could communicate with them. Next one. Next slide. Thank you. Catch-up English clubs. We said there were a few already observed. We encourage much more use of catch-up English clubs for all learners in need. But it's important that these catch-up clubs were for refugee children and for host children, because if you tempted, as had happened in a few cases, just for refugee children, immediately the host children begin to feel a little resentful that too much is being done for the refugees. Where the host children also had an English problem, then they would be in the catch-up club, but it would be based on the language level of the children, not on whether they were refugee or host. Remedial and literacy clubs were set up. And then the third suggestion, which was fairly new and hasn't taken off very much, was to set up bilingual subject clubs or tutorials. The idea being each week you'd get together with children who spoke the same language, and they'd go over the lessons of the week, discuss them in their own language and in English, and make sure those who are weakest in English could review some of the things they hadn't understood in the classroom. So that was a sort of bilingual tutorials, which could be led either by a strong student, so it was peer-to-peer, or by a teacher who understood both languages. Okay, next one. L1, FL to scaffold. We did a lot of work on scaffolding. Use the foreign language, the familiar language, to introduce the lesson, to scaffold learning. So you introduce the lesson, you outline the new concepts, any new words, and tell the learners what will happen in the lesson. But then you teach the main lesson in English. So it's important to have clear principled use of the familiar language, not any old use. We would recommend avoid translating everything at the end of the lesson, because if you do that, everybody falls asleep and waits until you move into the language they understood. So it's a matter of using at the beginning and for key concepts. Use bilingual students to help others. I think we've said this already. And therefore, if a teacher can't speak the learner's language, and you can't expect our teachers to speak 19 different languages, then you identify bilingual speakers who can help and re-explain the introduction and translate key words. I agree that the person who said avoid translating the whole lesson, but translation of key words and the odd concept is fine. Assessment,
Yeah.
you can...
Right. And I think some of the schools had done is they had employed assistant teachers from the refugee communities. So that helped in terms of getting additional people who could either were bilingual or could also speak the children's language. Thanks.
Right, yes, wherever possible. I don't know whether we put that in somewhere, but language assistants we did encourage. The problem was when you've got a classroom of 300, what the head teachers were tending, they'd get these language assistants who were excellent and would be, often they were refugees themselves, and then the head teacher would say, oh, that's a good teacher, and they'd suddenly turn them into teachers. So you'd find this refugee assistant who was meant to be helping in the classroom, the different language groups, had actually turned himself into a brilliant teacher, but now had their own class. And so the idea of language assistance is excellent, but when you're faced with very big classes, they of course are turned into teachers. And the better they are, the more likely they are to be taken away from their role as language assistants and become teachers. But yeah, that's a long-term solution. On the assessment, it's quite a good, if I was a teacher, and a lot of teachers did it, they're teaching in English, and then to check whether the student has understood the key point, they might ask, so what does so-and-so mean in your language? And then it's the learner that uses language, and rather than teacher having to know the language. So I would ask in a language, I don't know Juba Arabic, but I might say to a student in Juba Arabic, so what does resilience, how do you say resilience in Juba Arabic? They give the answer, and other speakers of Juba Arabic will say, yeah, that's right, or no, it means. Next slide. Okay, any questions about the recommendations? Just give a few minutes for any Q&A on what I've said so far before we look at what happened to these recommendations. That's a pause for questions, if there are any coming up. And a pause for me to breathe. Sharon, are there any QAs? I can't see my questions. Yeah.
We
Yes.
received two comments about the guidelines earlier. You asked if anybody would like to share any guidelines. So Ida says, I suggest the teacher talk in both languages, in English and students' native language, and be empathetic and kind. And Ima suggests, another question. Ima asked a question. Should I possibly have have any information about the Ugandan curriculum? I think they may find on I don't know if it's possible. Maybe the publication is a good starting point, Ima, because it's clearly suggests lots of practical advice about the tips as well, about the steps to take for the teacher. And another question we received, let me read that. Selena asks, from Nigeria, how do we group students with multiple languages in the same class for effective learning?
Yeah, yes, good questions. Do you want me to come in there, Selena?
Yes.
Shall I butt in there? Just on the on the teacher talk, I absolutely agree, but I think the way talking both languages, yes, but at which point and what you do in the first language as against what you do in the second language is very important. We're going to come back to that actually after we look at what happened to the recommendations. In the question of the Uganda curriculum, it's a very good curriculum, very interesting curriculum, and it states that up until the end of grade 3, all subject knowledge is not subject, it's thematic. So everything is arranged as a thematic curriculum up until the end of grade 3 to be taught in the local language. And they teach in about 35 different languages, which is quite an achievement. And the communities are very keen their own languages are used. Then in fourth year, grade 4, they switch from thematic to subject, and that is a transition year where they're encouraged to use both the local language and English, with the last term being sort of 80% English. And if you look at the curriculum, the curriculum for grades 1 to 4 has a wide range of recommendations for activities across each theme. Does that answer the questions? Have I missed something?
No, thank you, Rod. And yes, the other question was about grouping children, how to group them in this context. So let me find. How do we group students with multiple languages in the same class for effective learning?
Right. We were recommending and trying with teachers to experiment with getting them in their local language groups. So if you've got a class which is a mixture of 3 different ethnic groups, you'd group them in their ethnic groups while they're learning English. But there comes a point where you need to break out of those into mixed groups, so they don't do everything in English. But there's a sort of very clear, particularly while learning English, that they can help each other, with some children speaking English well, helping those with weaker. And that seemed to work. And a lot of that had happened naturally. Equally naturally was the way a good English speaker would naturally go and help their own people. You didn't even teach. Some teachers tried to stop them, saying, no, stop talking. But it was actually working quite well, especially once we encouraged it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Nahid made a comment. So from Australia, from my experience, like you said, to be bilingual teacher would be very helpful in teaching target language. We have to teach English as a whole class, but whenever students confused, we can explain in L2 to make everything clear for them. And also use lots of body language, TPR, and repetition for lower levels. So we received comments from our participants. So another one is about parents, and also we received another comment about parents too. If you would like to comment on this, Roderick, I will move on to some comments about parents.
I think, can we come back to that comment?
Yes, sure.
Because I think we're going to cover quite a few of the particularly the importance of the 2 languages as we go into the next section. I'm just seeing the time. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. I hope we have more time. There's 2 more times. Quickly go on to the next.
Rod, before you move on to the next, maybe you could, or maybe I could just say, the context with which we worked was more for primary school children, and so the interactions was with primary school. I can see a few questions around university students. So we only worked with primary schools. We had British Council and Windows supporting us because that was the jurisdiction or the scope of the research. So we might not be able to answer what happens to the university student. I'm sure the people in that level would tell you what they do, but for us it was mainly what was happening at primary school level. How are the children starting off when they came to Uganda, and how are they being integrated, and especially how are they being placed? So if we can't answer the university ones, please forgive us. Our scope was mainly on primary education. Right, over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me go forward. Oops. So we gave all the recommendations that I've just covered. We then, with British Council support, of course, conducted training for teachers in 4 of the settlements and in 100 schools. They were given the handbooks. They were trained in all the recommendations, particularly on bilingual use, as suggested, and on setting up the clubs. Then after the training, the teachers went back to their schools, and it was probably not all teachers in the school, but quite significant numbers. We waited 3 months, and then we went out to see what had happened and what the impact of these recommendations had been. So the final piece of research was to observe to what extent teachers had now changed their teaching habits and to what extent they were following the advice given. Next slide. So if you think about the main recommendations on which teachers were trained, can you think, but they were trained on bilingual strategies, using groups that speak the same language, establishing clubs for subjects, placement using written exams, and accelerated promotion. Those were the key areas we trained them on, as said. Using your Q&A, can you predict what you think might work and what you think might have gone wrong? I'll just give you a minute to make your own predictions. You don't have to announce them, but if you could put them in the Q&A, we could then compare them with what we found out. Do you think these recommendations are going to be accepted by teachers, or do you think things are going to go wrong when we do the findings? Next slide. Any predictions? If you have predictions, you write them in while I tell you what actually happened. Okay. What worked? Once we carried out this last piece of research, the good news was we saw there was an increasing use of the first and familiar language in all classes observed. And the majority of teachers said they now scaffold their lessons and use their first language to scaffold the lessons which they're teaching in English with introductions, etc. And that was very encouraging. Go back to the 2018-19 research, something like over half the teachers had said you should never use a foreign language, another language when teaching English. By the time we got to the final piece of research, that number was below 20%. So a big improvement in understanding that you didn't have to be monolingual. Secondly, more schools were using catch-up English classes, and these were now in the settlements rather than just Kampala. In fact, we didn't look in Kampala very much. And they were using these as tutorials, and they were free because obviously your majority of your settlement children come from very deprived backgrounds. So you got the catch-up working. Teachers were learning the language of their students. A number recognize now this is much more important, and were trying to learn at least one language of their students. Swahili was very popular because it's a useful language in Uganda, as well as being in refugees, but others were able to speak Kakwa. Several teachers were very proud of being able to speak Kakwa, which was a common language from South Sudan, and not used much in one area of Uganda only. There was a big increase in peer-to-peer learning because teachers are now recognizing this as a plus, not a minus. Rather than trying to stop it happening in the classroom, they were encouraging it. All schools agreed that they were now using accelerated promotion, and they would promote newcomers as soon as they were ready. And 3 of the settlements, at least, are now using the bridging course. And that has been dependent on donor money because it costs a bit. So, but I know of at least 3 settlements where there's been funded use of the bridging course, so that people, mainly coming from DRC, which is the largest number of refugees coming in over the last year, being French speakers, the bridging course has proved very successful. Continue. Next slide. But the big lesson, I think, for me, was that bilingual approaches are very, very useful, but there are weaknesses if it's not done appropriately. The key weakness observed in bilingual approaches is that use of L1 that a majority didn't understand. What I mean by that is, you can help me, in Naka Valley, the local language is, what's the local language? Can you remember, Lucy? Anyway, you can't. It's one of the K languages. But lessons were being taught in that language, but only half the children understood that language. And a majority of the refugees didn't. So a lot were and in Uganda and in Kampala, more lessons were being taught in Luganda, but the refugees didn't understand. So they were using a local language, but only one. Secondly, too much of the lesson is in the L1. They tended to be under 10% or 80% of the lesson. So in grade 5, 6, 7, which is English medium, you would hear that 80% of the lesson is in the local language, in local languages, which was not giving enough exposure to English. Third problem, all the oral work is done in the L1 or FL, but the reading was all done in English. So the teacher would teach the language, would teach the content of the science lesson in Luganda, but then give them passages to read in English. So there's a complete breakdown in between the spoken and the written language. You're getting no carryover of learning of English from oral to reading. So lastly, teachers teach in English and then summarize everything at the end in L1. So those are the dangers. Next slide, I think we've got more dangers. Yeah, particularly bad habit was they write on the blackboard in English and then translate word for word what is on the blackboard. So the children are not actually developing any concepts in English. Some teachers use complex English and then switch to L1 when not understood. So you might say, language of resilience is essential to the compatible learning of. Nobody understands. So then I just say it in Luganda rather than saying it in simple English. And the key weakness is to remember, my takeaway is that too much L1 may hamper the learning of English. That's too much L1 when teaching subjects like science, maths, etc. But using too little may hamper the learning of the subject. So teachers have to find that compromise. Lucy? Next. So how do we create the balance for teachers? How do we train teachers on appropriate bilingual approaches? Addressing the issue of using two languages and ensure a better understanding of bilingual approaches so that teachers recognize its strengths, but also recognize its dangers. I keep using the word, yes, I say it in there. Recognize that a principal use of the L1 can help learners learn the subject and learn English. Teachers need to understand how to scaffold using the L1 to teach the body of the lesson in English. Of course, the real answer is strengthen the English of learners with initial emphasis on listening skills. And finally, strengthening the subject teacher's use of English as a classroom language. So one can do a lot to develop the English of the teacher. Lucy mentioned our research into the language of the teachers. In general, we found Ugandan teachers' English is very good. Ugandans should be proud of their teachers' ability to talk in English. It wasn't lack of English that was a problem, except for about 10% of teachers. It was actually the way they used English for instruction. They tended to make the language too difficult, too complex. They didn't know how to give examples. They need to learn classroom language, how to simplify, how to elicit, how to explain, how to rephrase, and how to describe. Those sort of 5 language functions that you need to be learning to use to do in English, rather than just switching to L1 as soon as somebody hasn't understood. I think I'm drying up. Yeah. Last word. I said it once, but I would re-emphasize, using too much L1 will damage the learning of English. Using too little L1 may hamper the learning of the subject. So we need a balance. Thank you for listening. That's a thank you from me and from Lucy. So any comments, questions in the time that is left?
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much. So especially the last part was very interesting for me to see the different points of view from different angles. So we have received some comments. And yes, the questions will come. So I'd like to read these while our attendees are writing their questions. So Abdul Karim made a comment. Target language English should be taught not only to learners, but also to parents, so that learners have more exposure to practicing English. Ibrahima wrote a similar comment for external activities, like at students meeting to discuss what they have learned. To be successful, the students' parents association may help. They need to be aware of such activities and thus allow children to actively take part in them. So what was your experience with the parents? Would you comment on these comments?
Yes, Lucy, you can interrupt if I'm dominating. I think the point about parents are crucial, but I think our findings was that most parents are speaking at least 2 languages, sometimes 3. But they're coming from these are refugee parents. They're coming from a lot of trauma themselves. If we can ensure they can get some literacy, it will really help. If they can learn a little English, that's great. But more important, I think, is for them to be able to at least learn the language of the community. So I'd actually say with parents, first make sure they've got whatever the community language is, Juba Arabic, Swahili, not the local language, but one that is unifying the community before they can help their children. And parents are under a lot of stress themselves. But we were impressed by the amount of languages those communities could speak, even if it wasn't the one we wanted, English. So yes, but I think you're expecting too much of many parents to expect them to learn English, because they've got so much to learn if they're recent arrivals. Remember, you're talking about over 1 million refugees coming in. Long term, of course, they'll learn English. Long term, they'll learn English. But in their first 6 months, that's a lot to ask.
Yeah, maybe Rod, I could add in, if you remember the experience with language in Kenya, in Laikipia for the Maasai community.
I'm thinking that.
Yeah, I think what we learned was that as long as the parents had a chance to encourage their children to do some reading at home in whatever language, their presence, it's not even about them understanding the language, the English language, but their presence in terms of being like reading buddies for their children really helped in terms of giving them time, space, encouraging them to read, having more practice. We tried in the Kenyan context, we tried teaching, I know it's not the same, but just bringing the issue of parents. We tried helping the parents understand how to read and write. It wasn't necessarily in English, but we started off from a local language and then a bit in English, but we found that immediately the parents were able to read and were able to have important questions to ask their children. What did you learn today? And then be able to just look at a book and see the child learned something. It actually takes you miles, and then with time the children actually teach their parents, and so it actually just gets better as it goes on. So yeah, as Rod is saying, it would be a big expectation for the parents, because imagine people who are recovering, they don't have a place to stay, they need to eat, they need all those things. So having them to come and study might be a bit difficult. Of course, those can be done within chat groups, women groups, as people settle. but it becomes very difficult within the first few months. But yes, parents are a crucial piece to their children's learning, but maybe not necessarily them understanding the English. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your input and insights on this topic. So these suggestions have been invaluable. And we would also like to remind our audience to download the handbook for the teachers, and from the chat you can see the links. And I like the introduction of your handbook, which says the aim of this handbook is to provide guidelines to teachers who find themselves teaching classes with children from many different backgrounds and with many different languages. So if you're in this situation, you will find these guidelines very helpful. They are very practical. Thank you once again, Lucy and Rod, for sharing your expertise with us. And yes, we hope you found this session useful, colleagues, and picked up useful ideas to reflect on your training sessions and in these kinds of settings. And please remember to download our publication, and we have a new CPD framework for teacher educators. You can find all of these links in the chat, and the recording of the webinar will be available in the next couple of days, and the link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive this week. And please share your feedback with us. You will find the feedback form as well. And don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter for teacher educators. And finally, register for our next webinar in August on supporting teacher development through the effective use of social media groups on 8th of August. So we very much hope to see you all again in our future sessions, and we would like to thank our presenters, Lucy and Rod, once again for sharing their expertise with us and research findings. We hope there were some questions about trauma. We thought this would be a very nice topic in the future for our future webinars. We have considered these questions as a separate webinar topic as well. So thank you very much, everyone. We hope to see you again in the future.